Hi, I'm here to pick up my son Milo.
There's no Milo here.
Who picked up my son from school?
Streaming only on Peacock.
I'm gonna need the name of everyone that could have a connection.
You don't understand. It was just the five of us.
So this was all planned.
What are you gonna do?
I will do whatever it takes to get my son back.
I honestly didn't see this coming. These nice people killing each other.
All Her Fault. A new series streaming now only on Peacock.
In Walmart's Who'Knewville, everyone ready their cart. Amazing Black Friday deals are about to start. Online and in the app, such great deals to explore. Everything you love from tech, toys, and more. The days to save and the ones to remember. It's only the 25th to the 30th of November. Set your alarms. Don't miss out. These deals are epic, without a doubt. The Who's are all ready, but are you? Walmart Black Friday deals await. Who knew?
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit purina.com/purple to learn more.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Professor David Woodman about his book titled The First King of England, Æthelstan and the Birth of a Kingdom, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. Now, we are going to be going very far back in time to the early medieval period where England was not a thing, and that changes. That changes in some really interesting ways. But the story here is complex and nuanced. We're not kind of talking about a straightforward biography of someone more recently alive. We're not talking about kind of England as we knew it today. It's honestly quite a bit more interesting than that. So, David, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Branda. It's great to be here.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, of course. So, as you said, I'm an academic. I work as a historian at Robinson College in Cambridge, where I conduct research on the early medieval period, and I teach both undergraduates and postgraduate students. And I guess my fascination, my interest in Æthelstan started a long time ago, actually, when I was an undergraduate myself. I vividly remember only in the fourth week of being an undergraduate student, I was set an essay about Æthelstan and asked to think about the main themes of his life. And it rapidly became clear to me that this person was someone who was very, very interesting and who had at the time no modern biography. He was the first king of England and we knew very little about him. So actually my interest in Æthelstan stretches back over 20 years now.
That is definitely quite interesting to come back to, or I guess encounter at the beginning of your studies and then come back to at this point. But I did have the immediate thought of, in either point really in your career, what sorts of sources are we working with? This is quite a long time ago. So is one of the reasons there wasn't a biography that it's tricky to put one together?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that is exactly one of our immediate stumbling blocks, so to speak, in that we have very Spartan accounts from his reign. So we don't have any major contemporary narrative source. We don't have any kind of biographical text. So his grandfather, Alfred the Greater, in some ways is more famous or better known in the popular imagination today than Æthelstan. He had a contemporary biographer named Asa who wrote a life and account of his career as king and of his life as a young child. But we don't have any kind of account like that for Æthelstan himself, which is greatly to be regretted. But what we do have are all sorts of contemporary royal documents of various kinds, a wonderful array of what are called diplomas, royal diplomas. These are sort of legal documents in which the king grants bits of land and associated privileges to various different beneficiaries across the kingdom. We also have law codes in which Æthelstan is prescribing law, trying to regulate the way in which his kingdom functions. And we have a lot of material evidence as well, which we can use. So things like coins, hoards of coins, different kinds of objects from across the kingdom. And I guess the trick is, and one of the really great points of interest in doing early medieval history is bringing all that evidence together. What does it say? What can we make it? What can we make from those different strands of evidence before us? We also have Æthelstan in the early 12th century. There's a whole range of historians who get going after the Norman conquest. People like William of Malmesbury, John of Worcester, Henry of Huntingdon. They're very interested in the early medieval past. They try to understand England's history in the wake of that momentous event of 1066. And William of Malmesbury is actually the person who inserts the longest and probably the most detailed surviving account that we have of Æthelstan. But because it's some 200 years after the time in which Æthelstan was reigning, we have to use it with a bit of caution. Was he inventing bits? Was he using bits that no longer survive? So on and so forth. So it's really looking at all of that different kind of material together, the contemporary royal documents, and then looking at the early 12th century material as well, and seeing what we can make of Æthelstan's life from that.
Okay, that's a very helpful sort of overview of the types of sources being put together here. But as a nerdy historian who likes archives, I do have to ask about one particular group of sources in particular. You talk about the middle group of diplomas. First of all, what is a diploma in this context? And why is this group so significant as source material?
Yeah, absolutely. So a diploma, as I mentioned, it's a legal document. They first survived from the late 7th century, and they run right their way through the Anglo-Saxon period, the early medieval period, right the way through from the late 7th century all the way through to 1066. And in them, mainly kings, they're mainly issued by kings, are granting bits of land to different beneficiaries, and they set out the terms in which that land is being granted. And one of the reasons that they're so important for us is that at the end of these lists, these grants of land, these diplomas, we get these what are called witness lists. Literally lists of names of people who were present at the meetings of the Royal Assembly at which the grants of land were agreed. And these witness lists are set out hierarchically so we can chart the peaks and troughs of different people's careers across those formative years. So that's broadly speaking what a diploma is. And in Æthelstan's reign, we have some, I think about 40, I can't remember the exact number, roughly about 40 surviving diplomas from 924 all the way through to when he stops being king in 939. And as you say, there's a middle group which are issued in the years 928 to 935, and they are completely different from anything that we see in the entirety of the early medieval period from other English kings. So he's the only king that issues documents of this form. And what's really, really important to recognize is that they only emerge once he's created England for the first time. So he creates England in 927, a date we'll probably come back to, and then he issues these extraordinarily ambitious Latin diplomas. And they are completely different from anything we've seen before. So they are physically much larger. We have 2 surviving original single sheet Latin diplomas that are preserved in the British Library in London. And if you go and look at these things, they're so big that you actually are given a separate large desk from which to view them. That's how big they are. Much, much bigger than anything previously issued by kings in early medieval England. So bigger in form. They're written in a professional kind of script, something that we've not seen before. They're written in much more learned kind of Latin, a very deliberately ostentatious Latin that's full of things like rhyme, alliteration, chiasmus, these kinds of literary devices. Basically, the king and the royal scribe who is responsible for writing these diplomas, who's known by an anonymous title, Æthelstan A, they're showing off the political success. I guess the way to think about them is if we've got these big royal assemblies where all of the major secular and ecclesiastical figures come together to witness what the king is doing in terms of royal policy, grants of land. It was an opportunity for the king and his royal scribe to show off the achievements of Æthelstan. So they're the most wonderful documents, really very interesting.
All right. Well, that is very exciting to kind of put on our journey as a marker for, I suppose, the future. Because, of course, before we get to Æthelstan and having achievements, we should probably go back before that. So we don't have an England to look at if we're talking sort of late 9th and early 10th centuries. We have a much more sort of complicated and interesting picture of geopolitics. So can you give us a bit of a sense of what's going on within Britain and a bit beyond as well in this sort of pre-Æthelstan time period?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good question and really important to set the background, I think. Probably useful to start a little bit with his grandfather, Alfred the Great, who we've already mentioned. Alfred was king of Wessex, so a kingdom that was in the south and in the west of the kingdom. And at that time, broadly speaking, there were a number of independent kingdoms who all had their own kings. The kings who could issue their own laws, they could issue coins, they could issue diplomas in their own right. So just as you said there, Miranda, not England as one, but lots of different independent kingdoms. So Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and so on. So different independent and at times warring kingdoms. Now, one of the major things that happens during Alfred the Great's reign is that the kingdom is beset by Viking raids of various kinds. And the Viking raids by the mid-860s into the early 870s are amplified in scope and ambition. They become very, very serious episodes, led in the beginning by a Viking called Ivar and his brothers. And they come over with what's called the Great Heathen Army. So we have this wonderful contemporary narrative text called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which talks about the arrival of this major heathen army, which proceeds to ransack the different kingdoms around England. So Mercia falls, East Anglia falls, and Northumbria falls as well. So in the face of this external threat, one of the things that Alfred and his advisors begin to think about is how do we ward off this external threat in the form of Vikings? And one solution that they come to is actually it would be better if we join together internally. We become stronger internally in the face of this external threat. So we begin to get notions of what it is to be English, for example. So at the court of King Alfred, we get discussions of what it meant to be a member of the English race, so the Anglo-Saxons in Old English. And he also brings together the idea of a new polity. So he tries to join together Wessex and Mercia into one. And Alfred goes from being the king of Wessex, the king of the West Saxons, to being the king of the Anglo-Saxons. So he's creating a polity that is slightly larger than the kingdom of Wessex in origin. So that's a bit of the background. So we have this sense of separate kingdoms, individual kingdoms, but also of Alfred in response to this external threat, trying to join together Wessex and Mercia in the face of Viking expeditions. Now, at the same time, because of the Viking attacks that were happening in the east and in the north, there's a large degree across the late 9th into the early 10th century, a large degree of Scandinavian settlement that is taking place in England as well, which results in an area of the kingdom being known as the Danelaw, an area where Danish law applied, broadly speaking. And that Scandinavian settlement, the legacy of that can be seen today in the form of place names around the country that are influenced ultimately by the Old Norse language. And that adds in a layer of complexity here too as well. So basically, by the time that Æthelstan comes to the throne in 924, there's been this huge wave of lots of different political changes where the Vikings are occupying the east and the north. Alfred, his grandfather, had been trying to widen the polity into the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. And Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, who's the father of Æthelstan, he tried to solidify Alfred's making of the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons as well. And he actually puts a lot of effort into militarily advancing into bits of the Danelaw, trying to reclaim bits of Mercia from Scandinavian possession. So very difficult and very complicated geopolitical situation.
Definitely. And also helpful to understand that Æthelstan is not kind of coming out of nowhere, right? So what do you think he's learning from the reigns of his father and grandfather before him?
Yeah, again, a really, really good question. So one of the things that William of Malmesbury, so that early 12th century historian that I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that he tells us is that as a youth, Æthelstan was sent from the court in Wessex to be brought up in Mercia. Now, I think that lends a very particular colour to the reign of Æthelstan. We have to imagine him in this Midlands kingdom, learning at first hand what it meant to be, subject to, what it meant to have Vikings as neighbours. How did you operate in this Midlands kingdom away from the centre of the West Saxon kingdom? So I think he would have seen that in a very formative way. And he would have seen the efforts of his father, Edward the Elder, who was, as I say, campaigning to ward off the Vikings in the Midlands, and indeed of his aunt, who was a remarkable figure in her own right, a lady called Æthelflæd, who was she had a formal title, Lady of the Mercians, so the sister of Edward, Edward the Elder, and she, so Æthelflæd and Edward, are very, very interesting. If we follow the annals in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle about both of them, we can chart very clearly the ring of defences that they set up in the Midlands, in Mercia, on the borders with Wales, in the northwest and in the north, where they're trying to build, they do build these fortifications known as burhs, which are very strategically located on Roman roads and rivers and in coastal locations. And they're designed to block the advances of Vikings as they're arriving in the English kingdom. So I think Æthelstan, he would have learned the importance of bringing people onto his side. He would have learned from Mercia the importance of securing the defences across the Midlands, and therefore the importance of the north here, that the Vikings who were settled in York, and sorry, I should have said this earlier, that there was a large degree of Viking settlement, in particular at York. So those Vikings who had come over in the late 9th century, they set up a major base in York, and they have links between York and Ireland at this point as well. So Æthelstan would have been acutely aware of the threat that they posed. The different generations of the family of Ivar, he would have been very aware of the threat that they posed from York.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay, oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Okay, so getting people on side, consolidating defenses, making sure that you pay attention to York, but are there threats closer to home we should understand? Was, for example, his assumption of rule uncontested? How did he make sure he was in a solid enough position to go about worrying about those up at York?
Yeah, very important to understand that, and it's a bit of a surprise, I think, the answer to that question. So his father dies in July 94, and there's an indication that Æthelstan doesn't succeed straightforwardly. So texts from Winchester record that his half-brother, a man called Elfweard, seems to have assumed kingship in Wessex. And it looks like, from the testimony of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that Æthelstan receives the kingship, or at least is made king, in Mercia. So we don't have much narrative detail about what exactly was going on. You know, was this division of the kingdom planned and ordered, or was there some kind of civil war between the two, or was Æthelstan asserting his right to be king from a Mercian base? We don't know so much about the exact background, but certainly there seems to have been some kind of competition for the position of king on the death of his father, Edward the Elder. And we also know, again, from the text of William of Malmesbury, that there were various plots to try to have Æthelstan neutralized from Winchester when he first becomes king in 94. So William narrates a rather wonderful story of a man called Alfred who plots to have Æthelstan blinded, but who is ultimately found out he fails in his plot, and he's sent to Rome as punishment in exile for his plot. So definitely there was an element of hostility to Æthelstan when he first became king. And it's interesting to find that although he's a king of the royal line of Wessex, he's a West Saxon king, that hostility is coming from Winchester itself, the heart of the West Saxon kingdom.
Yeah, that is definitely quite interesting. So thank you for telling us about that. He does, however, successfully consolidate his position. He does have to worry, as we've discussed, about the Danelaw. One thing, though, he was also apparently pretty into that we haven't mentioned yet is religious relics. Why was this such a big deal to him? What sort of political and religious purposes did it have for him to get these? Why was this a thing he was spending his time on?
We know from lots of different sources actually that Æthelstan had a very particular fondness for religious relics, as you say. So we have letters from Europe talking about this. We have accounts of relic lists from different places like Exeter, which talk about relics that Æthelstan had given to the Exeter Church. So he's renowned not just as a collector of relics, but also as a donor of relics to different places. And I think there are probably various reasons why this was important to Æthelstan. Firstly, I think we shouldn't doubt that these had a real personal significance to him. So from various bits of other evidence, we know that he was a very pious king. There's a contemporary poem called Rex Pius Æthelstan, Holy King Æthelstan, which celebrates Æthelstan as a very pious king. So they definitely had a sort of personal meaning to him. We can imagine that he felt proximity to the saints of the relics concerned. But they were also a way of, I guess, bringing a kind of religious authority, a way of sort of giving a stamp of approval, a religious stamp of approval, a divine stamp of approval to his reign itself. So that was certainly very important to him as well. And then as a donor of relics, by giving different relics to different communities across his kingdom, it was a way of Æthelstan trying to enmesh those communities within, I guess, networks of obligation and friendship. So particularly as he tries to spread his dominion, his authority northwards, he tries to bring on board different religious communities, including St. Cuthbert's community. And we see him giving gifts like relics, precious objects, alongside gifts of land and other things. So he's using it as a sort of political tool as well.
Okay, so he's consolidating his position sort of immediately. He's then expanding, bringing different communities on side. Lots of kind of expansion or consolidation, I suppose, going on there. You mentioned 927. What happens in this key year? And to what extent do we think of it as a key year now? And maybe it wasn't as big a deal at the time, or was it?
Yeah, very good. So he became king in, as I said, in 924 on the death of Edward. And as we said, it was a rather contested accession to the kingdom with his half brother. I should have said that his half brother dies 4 weeks later, so he's out of the way, and then Æthelstan becomes the sole king. And at that point, he's king of the Anglo-Saxons, it seems. So he's king of the polity that his grandfather had first created in the 880s. So he's king of the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. Now, by 927, what's happened is that the Viking king in York, who was a man called Sitric, has died. And that opens an opportunity for Æthelstan to spread his power northwards if he wants to. And we find Æthelstan trying very quickly to bring Northumbria within his control. So in 927, he goes north. Again, from the text of William of Mons, we think that he conducts a military campaign there. He brings York under his control. And it's from this moment in 927 that an England of a recognizable geographical and political form, recognizable to us, is first formed. So it's an extraordinarily important date in our history. I've always found it amazing that, we simply don't know the date 927 in the same way that we know the date when England was undone in 1066. And it seems to me that that's a real problem here, that actually 927 deserves a lot more recognition as the moment when England was formed for the very first time. And it's absolutely the case that contemporaries witnessed this, understood the significance of that moment in 927. I've already mentioned the wonderful diplomas that follow by his royal scribe Æthelstan A, who commemorates this occasion by creating this wholly new form of diplomatic document. He also styles Æthelstan in a wholly new way as well. He's called the Rex Anglorum in Latin, the King of the English. It's the first time that style's been deployed in a genuine document like that. And likewise on the coins. So coins, we can imagine that coins must have been a very powerful tool for propaganda, for sending out political messages of various kinds. And at just the moment that his diplomas are changing to register that he's the Rex Anglorum, so too do his coins give similar messages. Again, he's the Rex Anglorum on the coins too. And there's an ambition that these coins will be sent out across the kingdom. So coins, diplomas, they're all saying the same thing about the importance of this new king. And wonderfully, we also have a poem. So we think that Æthelstan was accompanied north in 927 when he goes to York by a retinue of different people, of course, soldiers to capture York in the first place, but also by a poet who we think was from the continent in Æthelstan's entourage. And this poet writes a poem which is sent back to Winchester which celebrates the creation of England for the first time under Æthelstan, and says that Æthelstan lived glorious through his deeds as a result of Ista Perfecta Saxonia, this England now made whole. So there's a whole range of evidence for suggesting that the contemporaries in 927 exactly saw the significance of what was happening.
So obviously it's important that he's telling people that something has changed. It's a big deal. He's making sure everyone is aware of this. But it's not just sort of saying things. He's also doing things with this new political power. Can you talk about what he's doing in terms of laws?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a relatively plentiful supply of law codes from the reign of Æthelstan, which again allows us to go right to the heart of the way that the Royal Assembly is working. Those people gathered around Æthelstan, how are they trying to regulate things that happen in the kingdom? And if we read the law codes very carefully, we can see the way in which he's adjusting the laws as he goes along. And one of the main items that he's concerned with is, for example, the idea of theft. So theft is clearly an important issue in the reign of Æthelstan. It's something that he comes back to time and again in his law codes. And what's very interesting is that we can see the king and his advisors adjusting their position about theft. So at first, they're very, very harsh. So they say that anybody who steals a certain amount of property and they're over the age of 12, they're outright executed. Later in another law code, he sort of goes back a bit on that, says that maybe that's a bit young, he increases the age. But then they change again. Later on, they sort of go back to being as harsh as they first were. And now the importance of that is that we see a sort of toing and froing in royal policy. The king enacting something, legislating for something to happen, taking stock of how that's landed, and then adjusting to things later on. And so the laws are very, very interesting for showing that kind of toing and froing between the center of government, so the center of Æthelstan's kingship, and the localities. So other legal texts from Æthelstan's reign, we get texts from Kent, from the southeast, where bishops report back to Æthelstan about the way in which his laws have been working or not working, so to speak, and the things that they might want to adjust. So we get really, I think one of the big things about Æthelstan's laws is we get this unprecedented view of the way in which law is working. It's a really interesting part of his reign that we see the king adjusting, that we see him doing things, trying things out, and then making changes afterwards.
Yeah, that's incredibly cool that we can see that. So thank you for telling us about it here. And obviously there's more details in the book as well. Thinking though about what he is doing, obviously he's doing these things, changing the laws. That's where he has the power to change the laws, is in England, this new thing that was created in 927. To what extent does he have influence beyond England, perhaps wider into Britain?
Yeah, well, amazingly, so in 927 we get this conquest of York, and very soon afterwards Æthelstan progresses further north to a place called Eamont Bridge, which today is just south of modern Penrith in the northwest. And a formal ceremony is conducted to which various kings of Britain are brought. So we get a Welsh king, a king of the Scots, and a king of a kingdom known as Strathclyde and Cumbria, so in the northwest of England and southwest of Scotland. And they're all brought to this ceremony, and they all sort of agree to recognize Æthelstan as king in this moment. And after 97, we get claims in his diplomas and on his coins, not just that he's Rex Anglorum, king of the English, but that he's also the Rex Totius Britanniae in Latin again, so the king of all Britain. So these amazing statements of authority beyond even England. So not only is he claiming rule to England itself, but also into parts of Britain as well. Now, it's very, very difficult to assess the realities of this. The diplomas of 928 to 935, those remarkable Æthelstan A diplomas that I mentioned earlier, they're very interesting because they list the names of various different Welsh, Scottish, and Strathclyde Cumbrian kings who do come to the assemblies of Æthelstan. So it looks like he has some kind of jurisdiction over these different people at different points. There's no other reason that they would have traveled such long distances to make it to Æthelstan's court. But we can also imagine that this kind of influence, these kinds of claims by Æthelstan over his British neighbours were bitterly resented. There's a really wonderful poem from Wales of about this period, and it's a bit difficult to date, known as Armus Prydain Fawr, so the great prophecy of Britain. And it's an incredible text, and it's a poem that calls in bloodthirsty terms for the British, the Britons, to rise up and kill the English and expel them from Britain. So that gives you a sense of the kind of British reaction, at least the Welsh reaction, to these claims of overlordship that Æthelstan was making in Wales itself.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. Doesn't need a lot of interpretation to understand there. What about Æthelstan beyond Britain? What sorts of ties did he create with, for example, European polities? And why was this something that he saw a lot of potential and use in doing?
Yeah, I mean, again, if we think about where Æthelstan came from, this marginalized position where he was fighting even to become king in the first place. And then within 3 years of being king, he's now king of the English, and he's also asserting rights to being king of Britain. It's remarkable that he's even able to adjust his view and look to Europe, just as you say, Miranda. So it's an extraordinary extension of political authority, political ambition. And I think, if we're thinking about what kind of person he was, it's these policies that really show just how ambitious and powerful he wanted to be. And yes, you're right. So in early 10th century Europe, so itself was very fragmented politically. The famous Carolingian Empire had fragmented in the mid to late 9th century, and in its wake were left different kingdoms and different polities of various different forms, places like West Francia, East Francia, Burgundy, Flanders, Lotharingia, so on and so forth. And Æthelstan, broadly speaking, tries to intrude himself into these different European polities via a range of strategic marriage alliances. So he has a number of half-sisters who he sees married off to different people. So Eadgifu, so one of his half-sisters is married to Charles the Simple, who's king of West Francia. Another sister, Eadhild, is married to Hugh the Great, Duke of the Franks. Another half-sister, Eadgith, is married to Otto, the king of East Francia. And then a final sister is married into the royal family of Burgundy. We're not quite sure what she was called. Our sources fall short. She could either have been called Elfgifu or she could have been called Eadgifu. So by these strategic marriages, he's making sure that he has influence on a European stage. And he's so significant that William of Malmesbury, again in the early 12th century, talks about the way in which European ambassadors seek him out. European kings seek him out. They send ambassadors to his court with lots of flattering gifts designed to win over the favor of Æthelstan. And this is the result, that he's able to put in place his half-sisters into these important positions of power in Europe in ways that, while kings of various different English kings before him had created European alliances, allegiances, this is to a new extent. We've not quite seen this kind of directed, I guess, foreign policy on the part of an English king before.
And what sort of impact did it have? Like, it's great that you can get your sisters married off. Like, how does that help England to do this?
I guess it means that, so you have to imagine a contemporary early 10th century Europe that is fragmented. There's a lot of jostling of power. So contemporary narrative sources by people like Flodred of Reims and Fulquin, they talk about the different rebellions between different noble houses, the way in which people are competing for power. So by intruding his sisters into these different networks, Æthelstan is well placed to take advantage of any breakdown in power or any kind of oscillations in fortune that might take place. And sure enough, we mentioned the marriage of one of his sisters, Eadgith, to Otto I, who was the king of East Francia. Well, Otto I goes on to become a very, very important ruler in his own right. He becomes known as Otto the Great, and he's crowned as an emperor later in his reign. And so with the marriage of Eadgith to Otto, of course, the line of Æthelstan is accruing in importance and power and prestige.
Okay, so let's see. His grandfather tries to put some of these pieces together. His father continues that. He manages to consolidate his position, which doesn't look super strong right at the beginning when he takes over. But not that many years later, he is declared in all sorts of shiny, fancy, new, very public ways to have lots of power. He's making claims across Britain more broadly, even if the Welsh are upset about it. He's getting marriage alliances into a number of different famous, rich, etc., prestigious European houses. That certainly sounds like rather a lot in terms of significance at the time. we obviously have the benefit of hindsight of number of centuries since then. How significant do we assess him to be now, given that some of those things outlasted him, but the actual England itself didn't quite, right?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, for me, he's fundamental to everything, really. I mean, he's such an important figure. He's the architect of England. I like to think of him as drawing up the blueprint for this. You're quite right that when he dies in 939, the kingdom of the English fragments. So a Viking called Olaf Guthferthsson is able to take control in York, and York is ceded once more into Viking possession. So there's definitely a political fragmentation after his death, and that maintains that remains the case right the way through to the mid 950s. So there's a period of oscillation in fortunes in the north, for sure. But Æthelstan's significance is as the person who did it in the first place, if you like, so to speak. He's the person who brought it all together, made it a reality, is extraordinarily successful and powerful, as we've seen on an English scale, on a British scale, and a European scale as well. So he's doing all of these things for the first time. And I think one of the reasons that he's not better known today is that he's a bit of a victim of historiography. So we mentioned at the beginning that he doesn't have a kind of contemporary biography written about him. He doesn't kind of have any kind of contemporary extended narrative account, which talks about his reign. And I think that's primarily one of the reasons why we don't know more about him. And actually, he's so deserving of the recognition of what he did in the first place. He was an incredibly powerful warrior king who brought these places together. And I guess another measure of that success, or a way in which we can see the real changes that were taking place under Æthelstan, is that he created a lot of jealousy and a lot of opposition to him, that he was so sort of ahead of his times that people were trying to overthrow him. So most famously in 937, we have the Battle of Brunanburh, in which Olaf Guthferthsson allies with Constantine of the Scots and Owen, king of Strathclyde and Cumbria. They rise up together, they join forces, they try to overthrow Æthelstan and throw him off the English throne. But he manages to hold them off and to win a great victory at Brunanburh. And so significant is that event that contemporary chronicles from England, from Scandinavia, from Britain, from Ireland and Wales, they all talk about it as a moment when there was a huge slaughter and Æthelstan won this major victory.
Well, now we do have a biography, thanks to you. So who knows? Historiography might have a different perspective going forward. But what might you be working on now that this big project is done?
Oh yeah. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed working on this book, not just because Æthelstan is such an interesting figure in his own right, but also because of thinking about a person through a biographical lens. You really feel like you get to, I mean, this is probably not correct, but you feel like you get to know someone and you can really form an intimate view of their actions and their policies. So I really enjoyed that. But my new project is a history of England from the reign of King Alfred the Great and all the way through the Norman conquests. So all the way through to the reign of King William I, and his death in 1087. So the idea is that I'll start with the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons that's created by Alfred, through to the kingdom of the English that's made by Æthelstan, how that fragments, how it's brought back together again, and then what happens in 1066 and beyond. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about the project is that normally historical accounts, they always they either go up to 1066 and stop there, or they start with 1066 and begin there. So the idea is to go through that point and to resist the modern periodization that's happened with the Norman conquest, and to look at the story a bit more broadly.
Okay, well, that definitely sounds interesting. Best of luck with that project.
Thank you very much.
While you are doing that, listeners can, of course, read the book we've been discussing, titled The First King of England, Æthelstan and the Birth of a Kingdom, published by Princeton University Press in 2025. David, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.